The rain had been coming since midnight, hard against the windows of the Moonlight Diner. Inside, neon signs bled blue and pink across the chrome counter, and the smell of coffee and grease had long since become part of the walls. William Carter sat at the far end, with a mug of black coffee, and 40 minutes before his overnight shift at the warehouse on Route 9. His right shoulder ached the way it always did in wet weather. He was not watching the door. Clinton Moore came in like a man who had never been made to wait. Gray suit, 2 associates, cologne cutting across the grease smell. He slid into a booth and reached for the wrist of the young woman already moving toward him with an order pad. Her name tag read, Sarah, 2 years at this diner, moving through the space with the economy of someone who had decided to take up as little room as possible. How long are you going to keep this up, Serafina? Low and even. Your father sends his regards, she said. Let go. Calm and final. William set his mug down without sound. 3 steps across wet linoleum. He placed his hand flat on the table beside the booth. She said, let go. Clinton studied the worn flannel, the hands, the absence of anything expensive, and smiled. He released her wrist. He stood and smoothed his jacket. You have no idea what you just walked into, he said, not a threat, something colder than a threat, and walked out into the rain. It had not always been 3 jobs. There was a version of William Carter's life, not so long ago, that had 1 job, 1 address, 1 reason to come home at a specific hour. He had been a Marine Scout, 2 rotations, Kandahar, and then a second stretch after that, and he had come back intact except for the shoulder that never healed the way the doctors said it would. He had come back to Rebecca, who had dark hair and a laugh that started quietly and grew before she could contain it, and to the apartment in Nashville they had been slowly turning into something that felt like theirs. Rebecca died in March of 2022. 18 months of chemotherapy, and in all that time she had not complained once in front of Bridget. That was what William returned to most often, in the quiet parts of the night. Not the last day, not the paperwork. The way she had carried that weight away from their daughter, carefully, without making any production of the sacrifice. He had not called the VA. He had not filled out the assistance forms. He had packed a bag, driven to the apartment in Clover Hill, where rent was $750 a month, sat at the kitchen table, and written down the numbers. $1,200 for rent and utilities, $300 for Bridget's school supplies and dance class, $600 for food, gas, everything else. $2,100 a month, minimum, and to keep his daughter's daily life from showing the shape of the hole that had opened in it, he made $2,600. 3 jobs. Morning deliveries for a medical supply company, afternoon handyman work when it came in, overnight security at the warehouse on Route 9. He slept in 5-hour stretches between shifts and kept himself running on a great deal of bad coffee. The math was tight, but it was stable, and stability was the thing he had decided to build toward. He sat at the Moonlight Diner, because it was the midpoint between the delivery job and the warehouse, and because Della Marsh, 58, former Army field nurse, owner of this place for 23 years, never looked at him like he was taking up a seat that should belong to someone with more to spend. Della refilled his mug without being asked, and stood for a moment behind the counter. Sarah's been working here 2 years, she said. In all that time she has never once asked anyone for help with anything. She moved a rag across the chrome. Tonight was the first time. William did not ask what she meant. He understood exactly. In the kitchen, Serafina was running cold water over the place on her wrist where Clinton's grip had left a reddening mark. Della had followed her in and held out a folded towel soaked in cold water. Serafina pressed it to her skin and said, I'm fine, the way a person says it when they have been saying it long enough that it no longer requires any thought. Della said, I know. Fine and not hurt are 2 different things. Serafina looked at the woman who had given her a name tag and a shift schedule and never once asked why she paid cash or used a post office box for her address. Before leaving, Clinton had paused at the door while his associates went ahead into the rain. He turned and looked at William with the even, unhurried attention of a man making a note of something. You walked into something you don't understand, he said, in exactly the register he used for everything, and then he left. It was the kind of statement that only landed with weight if you were afraid of what came after it. William left money for the coffee and went to the warehouse on time. The phone call came the next morning while Della was turning chairs down from the tables and the coffee was still in its first pot. A polished, legal-sounding voice explained that the security footage from the previous evening would be required as evidence in an ongoing civil matter, and would she please preserve a copy for transfer. Della said she would look into it. She started to end the call. The man used a name before she could hang up. Not Sarah. Serafina Dawson. He said it the way lawyers say things they already know as a formality, not new information. Della stood in the middle of her diner for a long moment after the call ended. She looked through the kitchen pass-through at Serafina, who had come in an hour before her shift and was already slicing lemons into the prep containers, her movements precise and unhurried the way they always were. She thought about 2 years of cash payments. A woman who had never used a credit card at the register, never given a real address, never spoken about her life before the day she walked through the door with a handwritten application and asked if there was an opening. She thought about the name Dawson. She thought about Dawson Tech, which appeared in the news with enough regularity that even Della, who had no particular interest in the technology industry, knew who Archibald Dawson was and what his company represented. She thought about the kind of name that would require a person to become someone else entirely, in a town far enough from the original life that nobody from that world would think to look. That evening, after the last customer had cleared out and Serafina had finished her shift and left, Della found William in his usual spot and told him all of it. The phone call, the name that had slipped out before the lawyer could catch it, the fact that Clinton Moore had not walked into the Moonlight Diner by accident or on any kind of impulse. He was quiet longer than she expected. Then, Clinton knew who she was before he walked in. Della confirmed it. William turned his mug once on the counter. Which means nothing about that night was random. She said that was right. Nothing about it had been. He sat with that for a moment. He left money for the coffee, pulled on his jacket, and walked out to the parking lot. The mist had picked up slightly. Not quite rain. Just the air settling. Serafina was standing beside his truck with her jacket on and her arms folded not against the cold, but the way people hold themselves when they are working up to saying something they have not yet decided how to begin. "You know who I am by now," she said. It was not quite a question. William said, "I know you needed help." That's what I knew when I stood up. The rest of it wasn't relevant then, and it still isn't. She looked at him not with gratitude, which he would have recognized, with something more carefully guarded than gratitude. The expression of someone who has lived long enough in a world where everything carries a price tag attached to it that she had stopped expecting things to be offered without one, and who genuinely does not quite know what to do when that assumption turns out to be wrong. She had spent a lot of time calculating every conversation, every interaction, every room she walked into, and what he had just said did not fit any of the calculations she knew how to run. Something moved briefly in her face. Then she nodded once and went back inside. 3 days after that, Bridget Carter established as scientific fact that the Moonlight Diner had the best chocolate milk in Clover Hill. William picked her up from school on a Tuesday afternoon, and she directed him there with the settled authority of a 7-year-old who has made a decision and considers the discussion concluded. She climbed onto the counter stool and set her drawing pad on the chrome surface, with the focus of someone who has been thinking about this particular page all day. 2 figures facing each other, one in a green jacket, one in a dark suit. She had shaded them carefully and spent real effort on the expression of the green-jacketed figure. "That's you," she told her father. "Mrs. Chen told me you stood up for somebody." She said it the way she said most things that mattered to her without drama, as though what she was describing was simply a category of behavior that her father happened to belong to, along with knowing how to fix a leaky faucet and make oatmeal that wasn't terrible. Serafina came out of the kitchen and stopped. She looked at the drawing, and then at the child who had made it. Bridget turned and looked at her directly. "Are you the lady he helped?" Serafina said yes. Bridget nodded with the gravity of someone confirming what she'd already suspected. "He does that a lot," she said, and turned back to her milk. Serafina watched the girl for a moment. Something moved through her expression that had nothing calculated in it. Something brief and unguarded that was there, and then not. Then she looked out through the front window of the diner. A black SUV was parked across the street. It had been there since before 11 that morning. No one had gotten out. She had seen it before, twice this week, at different times, always during her shift, always just sitting there. Her hand tightened on the dish towel she was holding. She understood what it meant. She had known for some time that no matter how carefully she had built her life here, it had a perimeter, and the perimeter had always been temporary. She had chosen not to look at that fact too directly. She had told herself she was buying time to think, time to figure out what came next, time to decide whether she was strong enough to go back and fight the version of events Clinton was constructing around her father. Now the fact was a parked car across the street, and a man's hand on her wrist, and the name Serafina said in a diner at 12:47 in the morning, and she could not look away from it anymore. William noticed. He did not ask. He ordered Bridget a second glass of chocolate milk and shifted slightly on his stool so that his back was no longer facing the window. Bridget fell asleep on the counter an hour later, her head tilted sideways onto the drawing pad, one hand still loosely holding the pencil. Serafina took her own jacket from the hook inside the kitchen door and folded it over the girl's shoulders without thinking about it, the easy motion of someone doing something they have done before. She caught herself a moment after and looked up. William was watching. He said nothing, but he looked at her differently than he had looked at anything before, less like assessment, more like recognition. Something had shifted that had not been there the previous night. When Bridget woke and William said it was time to go, Serafina asked if she could come with them. Plainly, without making an apology of it, he said yes the same way. She brought her bag. His apartment on Hazel Street was on the third floor of a building that smelled of carpet cleaner and the cooking of the tenant below. Inside it was clean the way military housing is clean, surfaces cleared, dishes stacked by purpose, floor swept, nothing present that did not serve some function. A folded flag in a triangle case sat on the mantel above the heating unit. Bridget's drawings covered every available surface, taped to the refrigerator, pinned to the corkboard in the hallway, propped in rows along the kitchen windowsill. Bright and particular, and without restraint, the work of someone who had not yet learned to hold anything back. He made dinner. Pasta, a salad from a bag, bread that had gone slightly hard on one end. Bridget ate 2 full bowls and told a detailed story about a boy in her class who had glued his hand to his desk during art and had to walk to the nurse's office with the desk still attached, which she considered one of the great events of the 3rd grade. Serafina sat at that small table and listened to the whole story and felt something she could concerned. Immediately name the quality of being somewhere that was not performing anything, not managing her, not trying to extract anything in return. A place where someone was making food and a child was talking about her day and the rain was coming down outside, and that was the entire evening. When Bridget was asleep, Serafina sat across from William at the kitchen table and told him the rest. Archibald Dawson had built Dawson Tech over 30 years into one of the most significant infrastructure software companies in the country. He was 64 years old, and 8 months ago, his physician had documented the first signs of early-onset Parkinson's disease, not disclosed publicly, not in any company filing, but Clinton Moore had a source inside Archibald's medical group, and the information was worth a great deal to him, because the timing was everything. Clinton was negotiating the acquisition of a major division of Dawson Tech at a price well below its actual value. The deal required approvals that only Serafina, as designated heir and future signatory, could authorize. Archibald was still capable of functioning and making decisions, but the window was narrowing. Clinton needed her signature before the board understood what he was doing, and before her father's condition became something the board was in a position to factor into their votes. When she had discovered this and brought it to her father, Archibald had listened carefully and told her she was mistaken. Clinton was a trusted partner. She was under too much pressure. He said it kindly. He meant it kindly. She left the following week without signing anything, without telling anyone where she was going. "Why not come back now?" William asked. "With what you have, the corporate charter has a provision," she said. "If a designated heir is absent from active participation for more than 90 days without a valid proxy, the board can appoint an interim successor." She looked at her hands on the table. "Clinton has 4 board votes. He needs 6. I have 21 days before the provision activates, and he has the position he's been building toward." William asked if she had documentation. She said she had emails, altered meeting summaries, and one contract Clinton had countersigned without Archibald's knowledge. William said someone would believe it. He said it without hedging, and she looked at him for a moment before she looked away toward the dark window. He went out onto the small balcony off the living room after she went to sleep. The rain was lighter now, steady on the street below. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out a photograph he had been carrying for years. Edges soft, surface worn from folding and unfolding. His unit, outside a forward base near Mosul, in 2008. He was 22 in the photograph. Standing beside him was a civilian in his mid-20s. Sandy hair, genuine smile even in the heat, a vest with a relief organization's logo. He had pulled this man from a vehicle that was on fire during a mortar strike and kept moving. The way you keep moving in a long sequence of terrible moments, without stopping to record any individual one. 3 months after that photograph was taken, a letter came to his unit's commanding officer. Daniel Holt had not survived the injuries sustained that day. His family and his organization wanted the men of the unit to know that someone had tried, and that this had mattered. The letter thanked the unit by name. It named the soldier who had performed the extraction. It was signed by Archibald Dawson. William put the photograph back into his pocket and stood on the balcony for a while in the rain. Then he went inside. Somewhere in the city, Clinton was already running the next step. It took 2 days for the video to surface. Edited carefully, only the portion where William was pressing the associate's arm back, the part where Clinton's hand had been closed on Serafina's wrist, cut entirely. The caption read, "Veteran assaults diner customer." By the time William saw it, the warehouse security company had sent a message about reviewing their liability exposure. His overnight position was effectively suspended. Clinton's team had also found a photograph from 2019, a bad night. 2 years before William had begun working with the counselor at the VA, who had helped him put it behind him. Context had no role in the story being built around him. It never does. Serafina watched the clip on Della's laptop in the back office of the diner and felt something cold move through her. Not because of what the footage showed, because of what it revealed about the planning that had preceded the night Clinton walked into the Moonlight Diner. He had researched who sat at that counter at that hour, who Della trusted, what kind of man they were. He had known a man like William would stand up. He had built the entire evening around that knowledge. A Marine veteran with a PTSD history and a bar incident on his record was exactly the liability that, once in motion, became the only story anyone would repeat. The plan had been for Serafina to be left standing alone, with no one beside her whose credibility hadn't already been destroyed. "He knew you would stand up," Serafina said. Her voice was flat with the particular anger that runs too deep for inflection. Della said, from the doorway, "Then we need to show him he calculated wrong." That night, Serafina called her father for the first time in 2 years. Not to negotiate. She asked him one question. Did he remember the soldier who had tried to save Daniel Holt, in Mosul, in 2008? The silence that followed lasted longer than it needed to. Then Archibald Dawson said, quietly and carefully, "Yes, I remember." Archibald Dawson drove to Clover Hill the next morning without telling anyone where he was going. He arrived at the Moonlight Diner at 9:43 in a coat too good for the neighborhood and dress shoes that were going to be ruined by the parking lot. He walked in without looking around, sat down at the table where his daughter was already waiting with a cup of coffee in front of her, and placed a manila envelope on the surface between them without preamble or greeting. Inside was a letter dated 2009. It was on the stationery of the foundation associated with Daniel Holt's relief organization, addressed to the commanding officer of William's unit. It thanked the men by name for what they had done in the field that day. It named the soldier who had performed the extraction. It was written in Archibald Dawson's cramped and deliberate longhand, the handwriting of a man who had been taught to write properly a long time ago and had kept the discipline of it, because it was the kind of thing that, once kept, became a point of honor. Corporal William A. Carter. Serafina read the name. She looked up at her father. She looked out the window at William's truck, parked across the street in the school lot, sitting there in the midday light, waiting for the afternoon bell. "You recognized him," she said. Archibald said, "I recognized the name when you called." Daniel wrote about that soldier in the last letter he sent before the end. He said there was a man who did not pause to calculate whether it was worth the risk, who simply pulled him out and kept running. He wanted me to know that name specifically. He said he could not in good conscience leave without making sure someone in that unit knew that Daniel had been aware of what had been done for him, that he had not missed it, that in the last clear moments he had seen the face of the man who came for him, and he wanted that man to know it had been seen. Archibald paused. He looked at the envelope. "I let Clinton persuade me that this same man was someone looking for an angle. I accepted that framing without questioning it. I didn't ask whether it was true because I didn't want the friction of finding out that it wasn't." He looked at his daughter. "I was wrong about that, and I was wrong about the rest of what I let myself believe." Serafina sat with that for a long time, longer than the silence was comfortable. She did not move toward the next thing. Then, quietly, "Do you believe me now? About all of it?" Her father looked at the table, at the envelope, at the gray light coming through the front window. "Yes," he said. "I believe you." He was leaving when William arrived, and they met at the entrance two men, 18 years, and a burning vehicle, and a letter kept in a desk drawer between them, standing face to face for the first time in the doorway of a diner off Route 9 in Clover Hill, Tennessee. Archibald turned back and extended his hand. "I owe you a debt I won't be able to repay in full today," he said. "I'll begin with an apology and go from there." William shook his hand and said nothing, because nothing needed to be added. Then Bridget came running across the parking lot with her backpack bouncing, climbed onto the nearest counter stool without removing her coat, and told Della she needed chocolate milk. Della was already reaching for the glass. The ordinary machinery of the afternoon assembled itself around what had just shifted quietly inside it, the way it always does. The technical team at Dawson Tech's main office worked through the night with the original file from the Moonlight Diner's security system, the raw digital recording pulled from the source hardware before any compression or transmission had occurred. The equipment available to them was not what most people have access to. When the restoration was complete, the footage was unambiguous. Clinton Moore's hand closing on Serafina Dawson's wrist, her face, controlled and exact, as she said, released 3 separate and clearly audible times. William Carter rising from his stool on the third request and crossing the room in a way that had nothing aggressive in it, the deliberate, measured movement of a man who had been trained to distinguish between force and the controlled prevention of harm, and who knew precisely which one he was executing. Garrett Finch, the attorney Archibald retained for the civil case, submitted the restored footage to the Clover Hill Police Department, alongside a sworn statement from Della Marsh and a formal recorded testimony from Marcus Pruitt, a retired military police officer who had been sitting in the corner booth that night and had gone home unable to sleep for 3 consecutive nights after. His 12-year-old daughter had asked him why the man who helped the waitress was being described as dangerous on the local news. He had not had an answer that satisfied her or himself. He drove to Finch's office without being contacted and gave his complete account voluntarily. Clinton authorized a settlement offer, $75,000, in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement and William's full withdrawal from any involvement in the matter. The offer arrived by hand at the Hazel Street apartment, delivered by a junior associate carrying an envelope and a pen. William read the document. He looked at the number. He tore the paper in 2, placed both halves back in the envelope, and returned it to the associate at the door without saying anything at all. 2 days later, photographs appeared on anonymous social media accounts, telephoto images of Bridget walking to school, standing outside her dance studio, moving through the ordinary patterns of her daily life. William saw them on his phone at 11:30 at night. He looked at them for a long time. He placed the phone face down on the kitchen counter with very deliberate care, the careful placement of a person exercising a specific and conscious degree of control over what their hands were going to do next, and succeeding. Lieutenant Henry Brooks, who had responded to the original call, and who had been tracking the shape of this case quietly and steadily, since opened a formal criminal investigation the following morning. Witness intimidation and criminal stalking were charges that even substantial legal resources had difficulty making disappear without leaving visible marks. Delamarche arrived at the Clover Hill Police Department 3 days later carrying a USB drive and no attorney. She sat across from Brooks and set the drive on the table between them. "I was a combat field nurse for 8 years, she said. "I kept complete records because I learned early that when something matters, you hold on to the original version of it." The drive contained 60 days of complete unedited security footage from the Moonlight Diner. It included 4 prior visits from Clinton Moore, each during Serafina's scheduled shifts, each involving extended and stationary observation of her movements and routines. Not a regular coming in for coffee. A man who had been running a surveillance operation for weeks before the night he chose to act on it. Brooks watched the footage. He made a call. Serafina stood beside her father at a press conference in the Dawson Tech headquarters lobby in Nashville 3 days after that. She was wearing a gray sweater and dark jeans, and had her hair pulled back the same way she wore it when she was clearing tables at the Moonlight Diner. She had not adjusted her appearance for the occasion. She spoke for 4 minutes and 10 seconds. She said the man who had intervened at the diner that night had done so without any knowledge of who she was. He had not stood up because of her family name or because of any calculation about what standing up might eventually be worth. He had stood up because she was a person who needed help, and in his judgment that was a sufficient and complete reason, the only reason a person actually needs. She said she had spent 2 years working in a diner learning something most people already know, and she had somehow managed not to. That dignity has nothing to do with what a person owns or who their father is, that the people most likely to act when it matters are often the ones with the least apparent reason to do so, that a man who stands up for a stranger at 12:47 in the morning, with no audience and nothing to gain and no one watching, represents something that cannot be purchased or credentialed or constructed through the right relationships and the right rooms. She had spent those 2 years working beside people who had very little and who showed up every day without complaint, who learned the names of their regulars and kept the coffee filled and covered each other's tables without being asked. She had arrived believing she understood the world, and she had spent those years slowly discovering she had understood almost none of the parts that actually mattered. She had understood power and leverage, and how rooms full of people in expensive suits operated. She had not understood what it looked like when a person simply did the right thing with no calculation attached, when the moment asked, and someone answered without stopping to ask what was in it for them. The man at the counter that night had not known who she was. He had seen a person who needed someone to stand between them and a situation they could not manage alone. And he had stood there not because of anything she could offer him in return, not because of her name or her father's company, but because the moment required it, and he was the kind of person who answered when a moment required something. She said all of this carefully, without inflection, because it was the most honest thing she had said in a public setting in a very long time, and she was not going to perform it. William watched the conference from his truck in the school pickup lane, phone against the wheel, volume low. When Bridget opened the rear door and dropped her backpack onto the seat, he switched the screen off. She asked how his day had been. He said better than yesterday. She said good, and then she told him about a girl in her class who had brought a lizard to school in her lunchbox, and it had gotten loose during math, and the substitute teacher had stood on her chair until the principal arrived and caught it under a trash can. Bridget ranked this as the single most interesting thing that had happened in the 3rd grade all year, and William listened to the full account and thought she was probably right. Clinton Moore was arrested the following week at a finance industry conference in Franklin, Tennessee, in front of 200 colleagues and a number of journalists covering the event. The charges were assault, criminal stalking, and witness intimidation. Lieutenant Brooks made the arrest personally and without any particular haste. 6 women filed civil suits within 48 hours of the news going public. Women who had run their own calculations about what coming forward would cost them and arrived at a number they were not willing to pay. The calculation had changed in ways none of them had expected, and they filed without being encouraged to by anyone. They were not the only ones who had been waiting to see whether it was possible to come forward and have it mean something. The Dawson Tech Board voted 6-1 to reject Clinton's proposed acquisition at an emergency session 4 days after the arrest. Archibald formally moved to appoint Serafina as chief operating officer of the company, effective immediately. She had spent 4 hours in the boardroom, presenting the documentation she had assembled over 2 years of careful attention. The altered meeting transcripts, the unauthorized contract, bearing Clinton's countersignature, without authorization from anyone with the standing to give it, an acquisition structured to remove value from the company before anyone positioned to stop it could understand what was happening. The board saw what they needed to see. The motion carried without significant debate. The civil suit against William was dropped the same afternoon. Clinton's attorneys withdrew from the harassment, proceeding without offering any explanation. 3 separate companies sent William employment offers within 48 hours, each letter using the word integrity, and each appearing to mean it in the straightforward way the word was originally intended to be used. He did not respond immediately. That night, after Bridget was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table with the 3 envelopes in front of him, and thought about the shape of how a life could be organized differently, not the numbers this time, but the actual form of the days, and what they were built from. Bridget came out of her room later than she was supposed to, and sat across from him in her socks without turning on the overhead light. He said he was trying to decide something. She asked what kind. He said it was about work, and described it briefly. She thought about it with the seriousness she gave to things that genuinely seemed important. Then she said, "Pick the one where you don't have to set 3 alarm clocks." He looked at his daughter. The directness of her. The complete absence of anything complicated in how she saw it. "Yeah," he said. "That's the right call." Serafina came to the apartment on Hazel Street on a Thursday evening, without calling ahead. She knocked. She had nothing with her. No bag. No jacket. Just herself in the doorway. She said, "I want to ask you something, but I'm not ready to ask it tonight." He said that was fine. He would be here when she was. She nodded. She turned to go. She stopped at the end of the hallway and looked back. "Mr. Carter." A pause, deliberate and complete. "Thank you." She said it with her full attention on it, not courtesy, not the form of the thing, the actual thing, held carefully before it was said. He said, "You're welcome," in the same register she had used. 8 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon in October, Bridget Carter learned to ride a bicycle without training wheels in Riverside Park, and both of the adults who came with her that day would have said, if someone had asked, that they had not planned to make it a regular thing, and they would have been wrong about that from the beginning. The park was quiet in the October light. Leaves on the path in amber and rust, and the particular yellow that only lasts a few days before it's gone. William jogged alongside Bridget with one hand at the back of the seat, then less of his hand, then nothing at all. She went down on a curve near the oak trees, skidded a knee, assessed the damage, and got back up. Serafina was on a bench, with a container of oatmeal cookies she had made the night before. She watched this happen and did not move. She looked over at William. He shook his head slightly, one small, clear motion. She understood it the way you understand a language you have been learning without consciously deciding to study it. Clinton Moore was sentenced to 18 months in a federal facility and ordered to pay civil damages to 6 plaintiffs. His investment firm lost most of its clients within a quarter. His name stopped appearing in industry publications. William accepted the position of Director of Training and Crisis Response for a nonprofit that supported veterans in career transition, based 40 minutes from Clover Hill. His shift ended at 5 in the afternoon. He set one alarm clock. Serafina told William what her father had said about reading the thank you letter again, for the first time in many years. Archibald had told her that Daniel Holt, in the last letter he had written before the end, had described the soldier who came for him. said there was no visible moment of hesitation, no pause to measure the risk against the possible outcome, just movement toward a person in danger, immediate and complete, and then the two of them running together out of the smoke. Bridget completed her first full circuit of the park path and threw both arms into the air. William rose from the bench. Serafina rose at the same moment, that precise synchrony that builds between people without their deciding to build it. Their hands met in the space between them. Neither of them moved away. William reached into his jacket with his other hand and placed the old photograph on the bench beside them, the group image from 2008. The edges worn soft, the surface faded from years in a pocket. Serafina looked down at it, at the young man in the relief vest, at the smile she recognized from photographs in her father's study. She placed one finger on the worn corner of it, gently. They stayed that way while Bridget rode her bicycle around and around the park path, and the wheels turned steadily on the pavement. Daniel Holt did not live to thank the man who pulled him from that burning vehicle. But the world has its own way of settling accounts, not through formulas or agreements, but through a child riding her bicycle on a Sunday afternoon, and two people standing close enough together to hear the sound of the wheels on the path.